This story revolves around one of the most fascinating criminal cases in recent years, the tale of Andrew Kissel, a man who had everything and lost it all, including his life. Our case begins in Greenwich, Connecticut, one of the wealthiest areas in the United States. Here, some of America's richest people reside, and Andrew Kissel was desperate to be part of that circle. The 46-year-old real estate developer hoped to make a name for himself in Greenwich. Instead, in 2006, he became the community's most notorious murder victim. When news of Kissel's death spread, many were shocked. Phil Russell, Andrew's lawyer, was stunned. He knew his client was just days away from pleading guilty to bank fraud in court. It was a complete surprise that something like this would happen to him, Russell recalls. This man had hurt many people, but it was about money. In a bank fraud case, this kind of violence is simply unusual. On Monday morning, April 3, 2006, Andrew was found dead. He and his family had been in the process of moving, and Andrew had stayed behind in their rented mansion. The movers discovered his body. FBI Special Investigator Stephen Garfinkel was called in to identify Andrew's body. For Garfinkel, who normally investigated financial crimes, this was an extraordinary situation. "I'm a white-collar guy," he explains. "This was the only time in my career that something like this happened." Kissel's body was found in the basement. Detective Pasquale Reno of the Greenwich Police describes the gruesome scene. He was bound and gagged. There was a lot of blood on the concrete floor. Andrew's hands and feet were tied. He was blindfolded and had been stabbed multiple times. "I believe the last stab was to the carotid artery," Reno adds. "He bled out. He lost a lot of blood. A terrible way to die. Very brutal. Nobody wants to die like that." There were no signs of a struggle and no forced entry. The police quickly concluded that this was not a random crime. As it turned out, Andrew Kissel had a long list of enemies. Carlos Truo, Andrew's longtime driver and personal assistant, recalls that his boss may have had a premonition. "He often told me that many people want to kill him," Truo says. Andrew's violent death ended a life that was once full of promise. He grew up in New Jersey, the oldest of 3 children in an upwardly mobile family. Carol Horton, who went to high school with Andrew's younger brother Robert, remembers the Kissels as a happy family. Their father, Bill Kissel, was a successful businessman with high expectations for his sons. "He was strict with the boys," Horton says. "He set rules and expected them to be followed." Even as a young man, Andrew was building an image. He always wanted to impress, recalls Danny Williams, a childhood neighbor. He liked to show off what he had. Status was important to him. By 1990, Andrew had evolved into an up-and-coming real estate developer in New York City. "He was financially successful when he started," explains Phil Russell. "He had a nice life ahead of him. All he had to do was stay on that path." Andrew had married Haley Wolf, a financial analyst from a prominent family who had been a world champion skier. 10 years later, he seemed to have it all. 2 children, a ski house in Vermont, and an apartment in a New York apartment building where he served as treasurer. "Everyone wanted to cozy up to Andrew a little bit," recalls Peter Chamberlain, a board member. "I had the impression that Andrew was pretty important." Soon, Andrew had his hands and his money in everything. Horses, an olive oil business, he even invested in a theater production. Brian Howie, who produced the play, remembers, "I thought he had good taste, which was flattering to me on a creative level." Andrew spared no expense to entertain himself and his friends. He was generous and lived lavishly. An 85 to 90-foot yacht, a nice pair of jet skis on it, Howie describes. And he didn't just have one car, but about 30. He seemed to be looking for things to have fun with his money, as if he couldn't spend it fast enough. While Andrew's spending and behavior were spinning out of control, some friends blamed a tragic event 8,000 miles away in Hong Kong for his actions. The competing Kissel brothers had each found success. Andrew was a real estate developer in Greenwich, Connecticut. His younger brother, a high-flying investment banker in Hong Kong. In 2003, Robert was one of Merrill Lynch's top people in Southeast Asia. He was one of the best out there, and he loved his job, recalls Frank Shea, Robert's friend. He was very successful and earning millions. Robert, his wife Nancy, and their 3 children lived in a sprawling apartment in a luxury complex overlooking Hong Kong. Nancy seemed very happy, recalls neighbor Trudy Samra. She was always trying to please R. She was always very proud of what he had achieved. To the outside world, she seemed to have the perfect life. But in early November 2003, Robert suddenly disappeared. She told me something terrible had happened, Samra recalls, of a conversation with Nancy. She sounded desperate. She sounded very upset. A work colleague reported him missing. The police went to the Kissels' apartment to investigate. When they searched the family's storage unit, they found boxes with bloody items and a rolled-up carpet. Robert's body was wrapped in this carpet. Robert Kissel had been beaten to death, his head bashed in 5 times. Police investigators quickly focused on Nancy. Within hours, she was arrested and charged with murder. They said she had murdered him, Samra remembers in disbelief. I just couldn't believe it. Not the Nancy I knew. She wouldn't do something like that. As investigators soon discovered, Robert's life, much like that of his older brother Andrew in Connecticut, was very different from how it appeared. During the SARS epidemic, when his wife and children fled to Vermont, Robert began to suspect something was wrong with his marriage. He hired private detective Frank Shea to spy on Nancy. Shea confirms, Rob thought something was going on between Nancy and someone else. He was right. Nancy was having an affair with a local TV equipment installer. Robert Kissel was devastated. All he wanted was to fix his marriage, says Shea. Nancy returned to Hong Kong, but Robert discovered she was still secretly in contact with her lover. In their last conversation, Robert planned to file for divorce. He said the marriage was over, Shea recalls. According to friends, he was going to tell her this on November 2nd, 2003, the night he was murdered. The case captivated Hong Kong. Albert Wong, who covered the story for the English-language daily The Standard, explains, I think it really hit a lot of people in Hong Kong. It was a glimpse into a world they're not used to. When Nancy Kissel went to trial in 2005, Robert's stylish blonde wife was barely recognizable. Nancy Kissel was always dressed in black, a typical widow's look, so to speak, Wong recalls. The prosecution's theory was simple. It was a cold-blooded murder. This was no accident. There was evidence that Nancy had researched and hoarded various sedatives. They also had a witness. Just hours before Robert was murdered, Andrew Tanzer, a journalist and neighbor, says Nancy made the 2 men a special milkshake. It had a strange taste, a taste I couldn't recognize, Tanzer recalls. When asked if he believes Nancy Kissel put drugs in his milkshake, he replies, "Oh, I'm pretty sure about that." Indeed, an autopsy would reveal 5 different drugs in Robert Kissel's system, including Rohypnol, known as the date rape drug. Frank Shea believes he knows what happened on the night Robert Kissel was killed. I think he was drugged. I think he went to his bedroom. I think he passed out. And I think Nancy Kissel then took a bronze statue and murdered him. However, when Nancy took the stand, she told a different story. She said it was self-defense. She really thought he was going to kill her. Wong summarizes her testimony. He came at her with a baseball bat. There was a struggle, and at that point, she just swings back, and he sits back and looks at the blood and says, "You bitch." And then at that moment, he charges at her with the baseball bat, screaming, "I'm going to kill you! I'm going to kill you!" And she said, then she blacked out. Nancy testified that Robert had physically and sexually abused her for years. Trudy Samra remembers seeing suspicious injuries. One time she had a rib injury, and another time we had a girls' night here. And she came in, and I said, "Wow, what happened to you?" And she had a big black eye. But Nancy had never told her she was being abused. Frank Shea doesn't believe Nancy's defense. "Do you believe Robert Kissel abused his wife?" he is asked. "No, not for a second," he answers decisively. Given the amount of drugs in his system, he was defenseless. There's no way he could have defended himself, let alone attack someone. It took 8 hours for the jury to find Nancy Kissel guilty of murder. She was sentenced to life in a Chinese prison. Andrew Kissel was obviously devastated by the loss of his only brother. But things were only going to get worse. What happened to his brother really affected Andrew strongly, says Andrew's friend Brian Howie. His life took a different course from then on. It changed his priorities. He said it was more about him needing to be happy now. Andrew tried to buy his happiness. He would spend, $50,000 to make sure his friends had a good weekend. Howie recalls, he indulged in extravagant parties on his yacht, fully stocked with every kind of food and drink and staff and everything he wanted. But where was all the money coming from? While Robert had played by the rules, Andrew had been taking illegal shortcuts for years. It began in 1996 in New York City, where he and his family lived in a luxury high-rise where Andrew was the building's treasurer. "You just don't think the neighbor is going to steal from you," says Peter Chamberlain, who was new to the board and confused by some of Andrew's reports. Nobody could explain how a hallway project could cost $2 million or $1 million. All the receipts, all the invoices, all the contracts were in Andrew Kissel's possession. An investigation revealed that Andrew had secretly transferred building funds to his own accounts. He was caught red-handed, Chamberlain recalls. He left the building in a very unsophisticated manner, jumped into the service elevator and out of the garage, literally running down 2nd Avenue to escape legal action. To avoid prosecution, Andrew agreed to pay back the nearly $4 million he owed. "We all wondered where someone who had to steal $4 million gets $4 million to pay back," says Chamberlain. For Andrew Kissel, the answer was simple. Another fraud, this time in another state, Connecticut. He moved with his family to Greenwich, where he bought and developed expensive houses as investments. Greenwich is probably the wealthiest town in Connecticut in terms of property value, explains Nancy Walkley, a title search attorney who had processed some of the mortgage applications Kissel had submitted to develop these multi-million-dollar properties. In 2005, Walkley noticed something suspicious about the signatures while reviewing routine documents. The A in Andrew looked very similar to the A in the first name of the gentleman who had signed the Baystar Federal Mortgage, she recalls. A quick check with the bank confirmed her fear. "The color must have drained from my face," she says. "I thought, oh my God, I can't believe that what I think is happening is actually happening." It seemed that Andrew had forged a bank manager's signature indicating that a $5.5 million mortgage had been paid off when it hadn't. "Had you ever come across anyone who had done something like this before?" Walkley is asked. "Never," she replies. Walkley stopped the deal, and as it turned out, it wasn't the first time Andrew had defrauded banks with forged documents. He had been doing it for years. Here's a signature from Juanita from November 2003. Here's one from January 2004. Walkley shows. It's completely different. The FBI was called in. Steve Garfinkel led the investigation. He would borrow money, file a fake release saying he no longer owed that money, then he would borrow again. Garfinkel explains. They would think the property was free and clear, and then he would go to a third bank and take out a mortgage, do the same thing. How much money was Andrew Kissel able to obtain through this type of fraud? Garfinkel is asked. It was over $30 million, he replies. I was impressed by this scheme in its simplicity, how easy it was to do. It was the era of easy money. The banks want to lend the money. They want these deals to happen, Garfinkel explains. And if they think they have a viable, successful developer as a borrower, they'll fall over themselves to lend money. This plan was bound to collapse eventually. When Andrew was confronted with federal fraud charges, he sought advice from lawyer Phil Russell. He described to me what had happened, and I told him, "Yeah, you're in trouble." Russell recalls, he was upset. He had been caught. No remorse, no self-flagellation, nothing like that. But Russell says Andrew showed remorse and was ready to come clean. He knew it was wrong, just not entirely clean. Wait a minute, so Andrew Kissel was trying to defraud the FBI? Russell is asked. Yes, he replies. The FBI uncovered another multi-million-dollar fraud in another state. He was a serial fraudster, says Garfinkel. He just committed one fraud after another. This time it involved apartment complexes in New Jersey. Here, Andrew had defrauded his investors by forging their signatures, secretly selling the properties, and pocketing all the profits. Some people put their entire retirement savings into this limited partnership, Garfinkel explains. Someone put all their IRA money into it. But in this scheme, the investors he defrauded were people he knew. His father-in-law and his deceased brother's estate each invested $500,000. The people in New Jersey didn't know these properties had been sold, says Garfinkel. But what he did was, he continued to pay them the appropriate dividend. What was their reaction when they found out Andrew Kissel had been defrauding them all those years? Well, they felt completely betrayed, Garfinkel replies. What kind of person can do something like this? Just keep doing it over and over and go on with their life? Garfinkel wonders. A very disturbed person, he answers himself. While Andrew's material world was crumbling, his private life was already in ruins. His wife Haley had discovered that he had forged her signature to obtain a fraudulent loan for their ski house. He was cheating her, and cheating on her with other women, says Private Detective Vito Colucci, who says he met with Haley a year before Andrew's murder. I said, "Well, you know, Haley, I have to tell you, I've seen many cases. I've seen many couples get back together," Colucci recalls, and she looked at me and just said, "I want him dead. I wish he was dead." Colucci adds, Haley didn't need tissues. Believe me, she didn't need tissues that day. Haley didn't hire Colucci, but in 2005, she sued Andrew for divorce and $17 million. There was no love lost there, says Russell. This was not a friendly divorce. On the first weekend of April 2006, Andrew's family was away. He was alone under house arrest, wearing an electronic ankle bracelet, and just days away from pleading guilty and going to federal prison for bank fraud. Nobody liked him anymore. Nobody wanted to talk to him anymore, recalls Carlos Truo, his loyal assistant for 6 years. Why did he stay with him? I loved this guy, and I owe him a lot. He helped me a lot, Truo replies. On Sunday, April 2nd, just before 6 p.m., Carlos went to see his boss. "And how was his mood?" he is asked. "No, he was happy," Carlos replies. He was the last known person to see Andrew Kissel alive. 14 hours later, Kissel was found dead. "Carlos, are you worried that the police might arrest you if they don't find a suspect?" Trudeau is asked. "Yes, I worry every day," he replies, so worried that he hired attorney Lindy Urso. Andrew Kissel had many enemies, but Carlos Trudeau certainly wasn't one of them, says Urso. He'd have to be the coolest customer you've ever seen if he really had anything to do with it. She adds, "He says he loved him, but you know, friends sometimes kill each other too." This guy was a decent, hard-working person, Urso defends her client. All the guy wanted was to work. That's all he wanted. He's the person who least wanted to see Andrew Kissel dead. Carlos Trudeau was the last known person to have seen Andrew Kissel alive, so the Colombian immigrant who was his driver and confidant became the prime suspect in his murder. "Did you kill Andrew Kissel?" Carlos is asked. "No, I did not," he replies decisively. They decided early on the Colombian helper and constructed their entire investigation backwards to focus on him, claims defense attorney Lindy Urso. She says the Greenwich police didn't thoroughly investigate other possible suspects, like the dozens of wealthy investors Kissel had defrauded. "We know that Haley Kissel's father was one of the biggest losers in this fraud," says Urso. "He lost about $500,000. And Haley herself had told people, including her sister-in-law, that she wanted to see her husband dead." Urso adds, once they decided that the wife had an airtight alibi, as they said, they turned their attention to Carlos, and that's where it stayed. Carlos seemed to have nothing to hide. "Did the police ask for fingerprints?" he is asked. "Yes," he replies. "Did they ask for DNA?" "DNA," he confirms. "Did you give it to them?" "I gave it to them," says Carlos. He allowed investigators to search his car, his apartment, and a storage unit he had rented. He even underwent a lie detector test, which he was told he failed. "At that point, I felt like a suspect, like a criminal," Carlos recalls. "They treated me like a criminal." "I found Carlos to be a very intelligent, calculating individual," says Detective Areno. "But they couldn't charge him. Lead investigators Pasquale Areno and Pierangelo Corelli had no evidence, and the investigation stalled for more than a year." Prosecutor Paul Ferencek explains, there really wasn't a viable case against Carlos until, well, when Lenny Trudeau was discovered. And that broke the case open. What broke the case open was a new witness, Lenny Trudeau, a 21-year-old petty criminal, and Carlos's own cousin. Lenny told investigators that Carlos had paid him $11,000 and a computer to commit a murder. He told us, "Hey, this computer came from Carlos Trudeau. This computer was given to me as payment for killing his boss," Areno recalls. But why would Carlos Trudeau want to kill his boss? A bizarre theory circulated that Andrew Kissel, broke and on his way to federal prison, had hired his loyal driver to have him killed. A suicide by proxy. One last fraud so Kissel's children could cash in his $15 million life insurance policy. If Andrew Kissel had gotten one shot, a single shot to the head, I might have thought there was something to it, says prosecutor Paul Ferencek. He doesn't buy it at all. He points out that Andrew Kissel's hands and feet were tightly bound with plastic ties, that he was stabbed 5 times. It was a painful death, says Ferencek. Nobody would want to go the way he went. Ferencek has no doubt that Carlos was involved. Andrew Kissel wouldn't have let anyone into the house he didn't know, he says. Whoever killed him, he knew him. I have no doubt It was Carlos Truo. That's why, says Detective Areno, Andrew Kissel was blindfolded and gagged. It's a personal reason, he explains. You just don't want to hear him, and you don't want to look him in the eye when you kill him, because you usually know this person. The investigators still didn't know the motive, but they had enough evidence. They arrested both Carlos and his cousin, and finally, on November 30th, 2010, 4.5 years after Andrew Kissel's murder, Carlos Truo went to trial. He was charged with Kissel's murder and attempted murder for the planning. The key witness against him was his now 24-year-old cousin. How important is Leonard Truo to the state's case against Carlos? Prosecutor Ferencek is asked. He is the state's case, he replies. Without Leonard Truo, I had no case against Carlos. If he hadn't cooperated, Carlos would have walked out the door. We can't show you Lenny's testimony. The judge didn't allow it to be videotaped. But his lawyer, Mark Sherman, says Lenny only helped Carlos plan the murder. He didn't actually commit it. Lenny had an alibi. He was at work in western Massachusetts, hours away from Greenwich, Connecticut, very early that morning. In exchange for his testimony, Lenny got a deal: 20 years in prison instead of life. Defense attorney Lindy Urso says that his own cousin's testimony against him puts Carlos in a very difficult position. It would take a small miracle to overcome this hurdle, she says. With this 20-year stupid deal his cousin took, if he goes to trial and loses, he'll get life. While the case against Carlos is circumstantial, it's still damning. They bought stuff, they planned it, they discussed it, money was exchanged, Prosecutor Ferencek summarizes. There were 52 phone calls between the cousins in a 4.5-month period. They had no interaction except for the planning and conspiracy of this murder. Lenny says he made 2 trips to Connecticut to meet Carlos, and there are Amtrak and motel receipts as evidence. Attached to the guest card was an original receipt indicating that the room charge was billed to a MasterCard in the name of Carlos Truo, Ferencek explains. But why would Carlos use his own credit card if he was using this trip as part of a surveillance to plan a murder, is asked. People do stupid things all the time, Ferencek replies. Everybody makes a mistake when they commit a crime. During one of these trips, Lenny says they went to this Home Depot and bought plastic cable ties like this. This is one of the things that only the murderer or murderers would have known, says Ferencek. And how close is this type of cable tie to what was used on Andrew Kissel? This is exactly the same make and model as what was used on Andrew Kissel, Ferencek replies. How would he have known all of this, is asked. The fact that he was able to describe the cable ties and where they were purchased was crucial, says Ferencek. And it turns out there might have been a motive after all. Carlos Truo had always been the trusted helper living on the fringes of Kissel's luxurious life. There's a transfer of $150,000 to the account of Carlos A. Truo, says Ferencek. Bank records show that when federal authorities froze all of Kissel's assets, Carlos and other members of the Truo family helped him launder money through their personal bank accounts. In this process, more than $200,000 of Andrew's money mysteriously disappeared. Perhaps the trusted helper wasn't so trustworthy after all. None of this money was demonstrably returned to Kissel, says Ferencek. He was murdered just 4 days before he was officially due to plead guilty to bank fraud. Did Andrew Kissel threaten to turn Carlos in to federal authorities if he didn't return the money? Is asked. I firmly believe that Andrew's motive was most likely that he was going to blow up Carlos's entire family tree, Ferencek replies. And you think it was money that was the motive? Is pressed. Well, money, and of course the fear of going to prison. Ferencek replies, Sure, people have killed for much less. Attorney Lindy Urso has been fighting for Carlos Truo for more than 4 years, and she feels the pressure. Obviously, I'm backed against the wall, but I still feel good, she says. At the end of the day, it's just another trial. But what's at stake here? She is asked. Well, the stakes are huge, Urso replies. But the stakes are always huge. I mean, whether it's 15 years, 20 years, or life, it's a long time for someone. She adds, but the pressure, the stakes are even higher when you really believe your client is innocent. With no physical evidence linking Carlos to Andrew Kissel's murder, the state relies on their star witness. The biggest evidence against Carlos is Lenny, says Urso. That's the only evidence against Carlos. And Urso says Lenny Truo is a liar who made up this whole story. Do you believe Carlos even tried to hire him at all? She is asked. Not in the slightest, she replies decisively. Not in the slightest. Not for a second. Urso claims Lenny implicated Carlos to prevent his family from being harassed by law enforcement. But prosecutor Paul Ferencek scoffs at this claim. Why would you implicate yourself in a murder? He asks. Why would anyone do that? I believe Carlos was involved, says Steve Garfinkel, who now conducts investigations for an international security company. He says Lenny's story is too detailed to be made up. It's a credible story, and generally credible stories are true, he says. Why would he plead guilty and agree to go to prison for 20 years if it wasn't true? That's a hurdle that's hard to overcome. To establish reasonable doubt, Urso plans to poke holes in the story and get the jury to question Lenny's credibility. He takes a little bit of the truth and spins it into a fantastic story, she says. Those 52 phone calls between the cousins? Records show Lenny made most of those calls. If Carlos had hired him to commit the murder, you would expect Carlos to be the one calling him, Urso argues. But what about Lenny's most damaging claim, that he and Carlos bought plastic ties at Home Depot? It turns out the receipt doesn't match the date Lenny told police he was in Connecticut with Carlos. This guy has no credibility, says Urso. I mean, zero. He lies and lies and lies. If Lenny were lying, there would be no way he could know all this information, Ferencek counters. There were too many details he gave us that were never reported, that he could not possibly have known. After a 10-day trial, the case now goes to the jury. Now the heart starts racing, because this man's life is in our hands, recalls one juror. We go around the room saying, "What do you think? And where do you stand?" And everyone would give their opinion. We would vote all the time. Guilty, says one juror. It all came down to Lenny's testimony, and who believed Lenny's testimony and who didn't. Not guilty, says another juror. It wasn't proven beyond a reasonable doubt that the two of them bought those cable ties. Not guilty, agrees a third juror. I live in Norwalk. We own cable ties. How do I know I didn't buy them that day? There was no proof that Carlos actually bought them. Guilty, disagrees a fourth juror. Did he just make up this story? Also, he and Carlos, although they're related, haven't spoken to each other for years, and suddenly they're having 52 phone conversations with each other. I personally firmly believe something was going on, that they were planning something. This guy Lenny, the juror adds, he pleaded guilty in this crime, and if he wasn't involved at all, why would he sign that paper? Why would he say, "Okay, I'm guilty, put me in prison for 20 years"? When it comes down to it, it's not about what you believe or what you feel in your gut, one juror summarizes. The evidence has to be there to support it beyond a reasonable doubt, and you have to apply the law. After 4 days, the jury finally reaches a verdict. The first charge, murder, could put Carlos in prison for life. In the case of State versus Trudeau, having come to a verdict regarding count 2, the court clerk reads, the jury foreman stands up, and Carlos is right there, and the guy is just shaking, and I'm trying not to look at him, recalls one juror. We saw the hands drop and start to shake, recalls another juror. We knew it was going to be very emotional for him. State versus Trudeau, would Mr. Foreman say, the defendant is not guilty. The clerk continues reading. Not guilty of murder. Carlos finally showed real emotion, recalls an observer. You told Carlos it would take a small miracle to acquit him of these charges. Attorney Lindy Urso is asked. Did that happen? Not quite, she replies. I wouldn't call it a small miracle. I'd say we pulled one out against heavy odds, but I don't think it's a small miracle. There's still the charge of attempted murder, but on this count, the jurors were deadlocked. I think the evidence is not there as it was presented, says one juror. This means Carlos isn't out of the woods yet. Prosecutor Paul Forensek wants to try him again. I never want to give up, and I felt we had a strong case on the attempt, he says, but there won't be a new trial. 3 months after Carlos was acquitted of the murder charge, the man who said he loved Andrew Kissel agrees to plead guilty to attempted murder. Carlos Trudeau has been saying for 5 years he's innocent, and then he goes before a judge and enters a guilty plea? Urso is asked. Yes, well, he's still saying he's innocent, she replies. I mean, it's clearly just a practical decision. It would have been a crazy decision to go to trial. If he had been convicted, Carlos Trudeau would have been looking at 20 years. He has agreed to go to prison for 6 years, with credit for time served, which means he will only spend 3 more years in prison. You know, he got off easy, says Forensek, but he didn't get away with it. He's a convicted felon now, so we get some satisfaction out of that. There is justice. Andrew Kissel, who had so much in life, died without anything, not even all the answers. Do you think we'll ever really know what happened that night? An investigator is asked. I really don't know, he replies. It's still kind of a mystery. And so ends our story about Andrew Kissel, a man who had everything and lost it all. His story is a cautionary tale about the dangers of greed and an example of how quickly a seemingly perfect life can fall apart. It reminds us that wealth and success are not always what they seem to be, and that the truth is often more complicated than we can imagine. As we reflect on the case, many questions remain unanswered. Was Carlos Trudeau really involved in the murder? If so, what was his true motive? And if not, then who was responsible for Andrew's brutal death? Perhaps we'll never know these answers. What we do know, however, is that Andrew Kissel's life and death represent a fascinating story of rise and fall, of fraud and betrayal. It's a story that reminds us that even those who seem to have it all often struggle with inner demons that can ultimately bring them down. What lessons can we draw from Andrew's story? Perhaps it's the realization that true wealth doesn't lie in material possessions, but in the relationships we nurture and the integrity with which we live. Or perhaps it's a warning about the dangers of greed and the deceptive nature of easy money. Regardless of what personal conclusions you draw, I hope this story has made you think. Remember that behind every headline, behind every sensational crime, there are real people with complex lives and stories.